Hello everyone. Welcome on board to another StudioPOD podcast. So let's welcome our guest today, who's really special. We are very fortunate to have Esben from Gehl in our studio today. It was such an inspiring discussion and talk with him and understand the journey of what an urban design practice is like, has been since last several decades, where Gehl has been at the epitome of what a good urban design practice needs to be. We've all have always looked up to the practice, and if you all are not aware, I request all of you to go to their website, check them out, look at the work. It's absolutely inspiring what they've been doing for all these years. And today we like to have a little conversation with Esben. Esben Kristensen is a partner and director at Gehl. He leads the international practice at Gehl. He's also an architect, urban designer, and overall an extremely passionate person. So this should be a fun discussion. And I welcome you, Esben. Welcome to StudioPOD.
Thank you so much.
Hey!
Thanks for having me here. That's such a great intro.
I don't have to say anything now, do I? No? Great. No, it's amazing to be here. It's first of all, the view is great, the place is great, and we've both the conversations that you've had previously with my colleagues and also the talks that we've had on via Zoom and so on previously have been really engaging. So I'm really excited about having this talk with you and actually getting to meet, and that a lot of this could potentially also bring things in the future, right? That we could collaborate in different ways and sort of help to do a little part in helping to shape the idea of what urban design could actually be, and especially maybe what it could be in India, to make it even more contextual. So I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple of questions, and actually a lot of questions for you. And every one of us who is young and wants to see themselves in the place of urbanism or change makers would love to hear your questions. I would start with Mansi. Mansi's got a lot of questions for Esben.
Yeah, I think I would like to start with if you could talk a little bit about your journey from the time you went to school of urban design and architecture to now being the director at Gehl. So, if you just talk about the journey and, what are the milestones and what were the challenges that you had to face to get there. That would be like a good start to an introduction.
Great.
So I'll kind of just rewind and start almost from the beginning. I think one thing is that I've always been fascinated with cities, and also with kind of anything that relates to how do we shape and our future in many different ways, and how is the relationship between the physical things and what that actually means for the societies that we live in, the ways that we relate to one another, and everything else. So there's a lot of interesting things in urbanism that I think even as a kid I was really much into. So I grew up in southern Denmark, 15 minutes from the border to Germany, relatively small town, 30,000 people, 25,000 people. But I mean, interestingly, these small towns, since they had such a long history, they were very compact examples of human scale urbanism in many ways, done quite right? It's 2, 3, 4, 5 floors. Even this small town had a 3-kilometer long pedestrian street, very active retail life. And of course I'm old, so this was in the 80s, but and sort of, they had suburban areas and sort of classic single family housing areas and so on, but also different kinds of more sort of human scale walkable urbanism with interesting things to see and good amenities and things like that. So I think it was like a little microcosm where I guess you get a little bit of a sense for what is achievable and what you can do. And then there was these places had a long history of decline in the 90s and 2000s and so on. And this thing I said about the retail, that's definitely not the case anymore. There's maybe like 1/3 of that left. But it's just the story and the way that things go. So I'm one of those people that I actually didn't really know what I wanted to do until quite late. I really liked architecture always, but I'd never really considered it a career. I think a lot of things always pushed you into going towards either something very creative like filmmaking or something like that, or maybe economics. I was all over the place. I think I put in architecture as one of my, we have a merit system. So basically, based on the grades you do in high school, they will give you entrance to whatever university you want to go in and what field. Architecture had quite high requirements, strangely, but a lot of people want to do it, and they don't have too many places for good reason, because it's not. There's sometimes there's too many architects and not a lot of jobs, at least in some places. So I get into architecture school, and kind of by chance, almost, and end up really loving it, and quite quickly going for the urban design. We had an urban design and landscape faculty. They were sort of collided into one, and really getting into sort of the urban design large-scale projects from early on. So that was a lot of my interest. The social element, the fact that you're dealing with people, the fact that you're also, trying to add in some things that's about more than just design and form and shape, I think was really something that I got into in a big way. Interestingly, Gehl as an office in Denmark at that time was a little bit obscure, and also Jens Gehl's practice was also a little bit, everyone knew it, of course, but it was something that happened much more out in the world. So Jan kind of, had his home base in Copenhagen, but he was always very, very widely connected to the rest of the world. So my story with Gehl as an office probably started when I went to do an exchange and an internship in Australia. So I went to Melbourne, and I studied at RMIT for a semester, and ended up interning at a local office there, Peter Elliott, which is a great architecture firm that also worked with campus projects and urbanism projects and so on. And I really, really liked the way that they had changed Melbourne from having a very, very derelict and beat up CBD to being sort of one of the most livable and interesting places that I've ever seen, right? And in a way where it wasn't what I grew up with in terms of sort of classical, great human scale. They had actually taken all the crappy spaces, like all the back alleys and laneways, the service entrances and where the dumpsters were, and it was full of rats and everything else. And they turned them into really livable, nice spaces through a number of different initiatives. So some of it was design, some of it was licensing, allowing bars and cafes and things like that to open up. And I think the most important part was they almost created a whole network throughout the CBD where you could move on the main streets, but you could also actually move on the back alleys. So a very different kind of experience. And these were spaces that were always in the shade, because there's pretty tall buildings in the CBD. They're not necessarily classically nice spaces to spend time in, but Australia is a hot climate. The microclimate really worked, and people attract more people, right? So it really started to interest me how this way of changing a city into something completely different could actually happen. And it turns out that this guy called Jan, he had a little bit of a sort of a share in that. He did collaborate at one point. I think he was a visiting professor at Melbourne Uni. Rob Adams, who at that time was the planning director of the city of Melbourne, they had a lot of relationship, a lot of chats and were sort of trying to push this agenda. So all of a sudden I was sort of like, that's interesting, because he's actually from my home university, but I've actually never really paid attention to him, right? So I came back from Australia, converted kind of into into that way of thinking about city making, where maybe before I would have been more on the utopian side or something like that. And then after graduating, I worked for a number of years for different other practices. I did a bunch of different things, and I think that's actually an important point, that we don't always have to rush. We can take our time, we can try out different things, but when you do it, then just go for it and give it your best. So I work in a space planning practice that basically worked a lot for companies and schools and universities and libraries and things like that. But essentially, I guess you would call it interior design, but with a planning angle. So like trying to get the programming right and aligning it with the user groups and maybe the strategy of the company. Maybe they're changing their way of working, and you want to actually align that with how the interiors work and how the spatial distribution of a place is. So in a way, very different in terms of scope, but very similar in terms of theme, right?
Yeah.
So I joined Gehl 10 years ago, and it was sort of just going from inside buildings to outside the building somehow. Like it made a lot of sense going from that, and then of course going back to my uni days, that had always been my interest. And then with Gehl, I think we're sort of born as a global company. We had always had many more projects outside of Scandinavia than inside Scandinavia. We started having projects in the world before we had local projects, and that really appealed to me. And I think there were some interesting things where it's not so much about taking a story of one city or one country or one Northern European way of thinking around cities and bringing it to the world. It's actually about learning actively from one another. And that I really liked in many ways, right? So I guess within the company, it's just a matter of hustling and keep pushing and being sort of pursuing your interests within the palette of things that you're able to do and within the people that you can talk to. And one thing led to another, and here I am today.
Yeah, so it's amazing the whole idea of what you have been talking about, right? Like as an urban design practice and the whole journey with Gehl. We all, when we started StudioPOD, it has always been a dream to kind of look at any of Gehl's work, whether it's all the books that he's written, and he started pretty late as a practice after his whole academic journey. And any kind of aspiring urban designer, if has to kind of formulate and look at coming together to work as an urban design firm, it's always been the first firm that you could go to and look at, right? And we did the same thing when we started 10 years back. The entire journey which you talked about of how it was always looking at more, because Gehl had that history of how the entire setup was done as an urban designer, researcher, and taking that knowledge base and working with cities all around the world and talking about how we can apply those methods, studying places and looking at methodologies to convert places like Melbourne that you're saying, and really looking at the core idea of people behaving the way they are and then transforming places to become like well-worthy living and habitating, right? That's something as a journey when you see as an urban designer is something fascinating. And when we started as a practice, it's always something, how do you kind of set up an urban design only practice, knowing that not many of them and do like that, right? And how would that kind of inspiration would go for any new urban designer who is trying to look at, because as you said, you had somebody who you could go to, and then when you started working with Gehl, it was always a lot of international work. And how did that kind of going globally, looking at things, how did that kind of work out in terms of looking at different practices, working with them, collaborating with them, and seeing how could you work in these places? So just like to know more about that as well.
Well, it's not a static thing, right? Because I think in the 10 years I've been in the office, we've also been on a big journey. We've grown our office footprint. We're working more locally, so we're actually working, you can say, deeper into projects and going further in the different stages of design, including public realm, landscape design, which you guys are also involved in, like as a way to like keep in the projects and making sure that we're actually implementing and not just doing broad stroke structure or master plan, but actually also showing what's the potential of doing this at the one-to-one tangible level. And at the same time, what you were saying as well, we've gone from a research strategy practice to also being very much about design. And I would say the majority of our work now is actually urban design in different ways. So it's not a static thing. And I think, of course, the blessing is to start off with an academic practice like Jens and having, that opens a lot of doors in many ways and allows you to have a lot of interesting conversations. But then once you get into those conversations with, you know, potential clients, potential collaborators, governments, you know, political figures, whatever it is, it very quickly pivots to become about the value that you can create together. And I think that's a key thing, right? Of course, I have a bit of baggage with me, and I have a nice little suitcase full of methodology and some thinking and some almost, you know, you could call it philosophy or something like that, because that's kind of what it is, right? Like it's, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I mean, yes, some of it is accounting and you know, scientific in many ways, but there's also an angle to it, right?
Right.
And I think in design, we use our knowledge of the world, we use our knowledge of a context, and then we create a narrative that's about changing that context, right? So it's always this thing about, are you changing something radically, or are you improving? What are you doing? And at what point are you actually pivoting into trying to be maybe prescriptive, or trying to be changing something for the better, instead of just looking at what there is, right? And that's an interesting pivot point. What happens there?
It's a very grey line as well, right? Like you, sometimes you don't know which part is more important. Like a lot of the times we also face that issue where, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, don't take away our roads because we're so there's so much traffic. But at the same time, we're like, oh, no, but you need more walking area, which is counter to the problem that, you know, the people are giving us to solve. But in the long run, it works. So I think that's very interesting.
And I think that pivot point is something that we kind of have to embrace, and we also need to embrace the fact that you never know where it is. And you know, sometimes you can kind of, and I guess it's maybe more when you start calling it planning, it almost becomes a little bit of a scientific discipline, right? Or at least it has been. And I think we need to kind of understand that we're doing both, and also trying to figure out, as an urban design only practice, what does the design component actually mean, right? Because it is not just thinking about, you know, form or sort of, you know, classic architectural elements. There's some different ways of doing things that are more structural, that are more, they might be economic, that might be about socio-demographics, like there might be about a bunch of different things that we can actually influence. So embracing that is kind of key to also understanding that we're in many ways quite different.
Yeah. I think it's also about, like for us, it's been also recognizing that as an urban designer, we can ask the right questions, but we might not be able to answer them. So you need the right expert to kind of answer that question. And so often we've like found ourselves saying, you know, because there's also this whole idea that you can do everything as an urban designer, but that's not the role. I think the idea is to ask the question and then get the right expert. So a lot of the times people are like, for example, lighting. And it's like, oh, we talk about lighting being important for safety and, you know, for as a very important player for public space. But then we're not lighting designers. So you have to, I think in India, we're also, there is this, we come from this baggage of one person designing our own whole city. So to the point where even for a small streetscape, we had to say, well, we're not the lighting designers. So, you know, please hire somebody who's an expert. So do you face that as well globally, where you had to get certain experts in for projects that were not originally envisioned as being part of the project?
All the time. And I think we kind of almost have it as a given, because when working in you know, globally and in contexts where we might not have a local presence, we, you know, at the baseline level, we need to work with local people who know the context well. Like that's just the basics of it. Then, you know, there might be building code or, you know, planning law or something else, mobility. And then you get into, as you're saying, things like lighting or whatever else it could be. I mean, so there's many different things and many different factors that you need to take in. So in every project there is some element of that. It just changes how the specific setup is. Yeah. I actually have a question for you, actually. So I think one of the things that we have seen, which is actually an interesting sort of, what can you call it, dilemma in many ways, it's that when you work with large-scale, especially urban design projects with very, very long time frames, and maybe sometimes also in places where things change quite rapidly, right?
Yeah.
How do you then make sure that whatever you're doing is actually viable? You know, just we have places where we've basically given up on the idea of doing the more longer term master plan at a normal detail level, and we kind of detail maybe the first step and maybe the temporary activation before that, but everything else is more like a loose structure or something like that, because, you know, there are places in the world where, you know, the economic ups and downs, for instance, creates a situation where, you know, you, instead of having 7 years of boom and then 7 years of bust, and you maybe have 6 months or 1 year or 1.5 years. So you just have a very tight window to actually get things done and do something viable. So that was actually my question to you. How do you, is that something that you're incorporating into projects, that kind of the long term versus the initial phases and the dilemma between the two?
Yeah, I think all the time. For us, a lot of the projects, especially in urban design, we had to actually, in the last 10 years, first convince people to hire us as a practice. And then once they did, it was about, well, the vision is great, but the proof of concept through the first phase or through the small activation of a part of the master plan became very important, and it actually taught us as well, because it taught us that a lot of our master plans have to be agile enough to be changing. Like a lot of the master plans pre-COVID just don't work anymore if they had very, very, very firm structures, because so many things have changed because of COVID. And I think that's something that we're also learning. So, you know, I think in the 10 years of a practice, I think the first 5 years, we only were working on larger vision plans, toolkits. And then somewhere after 5 years, Sarfraz said, well, we need to build something. Otherwise, you know, in the next 5 years, otherwise, we're just going to become making books that just go on shelves. So I think that became a big change point, where now we talk about these larger projects, but bite-size implementations that can be done, and we're doing that for like government projects also, for private also, because even for numbers and everything, you need to go back and analyze and see whether the larger strategy is working. So we're doing that all the time, where we're completely shuffling scales between, you know, this is the larger long-term vision, 25-year vision, and here is the 5-month plan to execute.
I think just to add to that, the whole flexibility, what you also mentioned, right, in terms of when you look at a larger master plan and how do you maintain some flexibility, but make sure the essence of the main framework is still there, whether it's like the transportation corridors, like the right questions to ask. You're at the end of the day trying to design for people, right? So even though you have to obviously talk about transit and make sure that in these larger frameworks you have to maintain those, and in an economy like ours, right, like when a lot of it is developing and a vehicular kind of driven decisions being made in terms of larger infrastructure projects being implemented and things like that, how do you still maintain, like, okay, at this point in time you need to kind of invest in transit when you're working on larger framework, and at least get that right of way defined in the beginning. You do not plan for cars from the beginning, even though you have to accommodate the initial phase of how the development will come in, but it's very important to ensure that you at least tease out the first infrastructure implementation project, whether you build in the cycle track, build in the right amount of footpath and things. People will come in the initial phase with their vehicles, and they'll come in and go to different kind of areas in the master plan, and you have to kind of look for the initial kind of the parking plan or whatever it is, but you have to get the framework in right, and the intent is not to build like 60-meter right-of-way corridors for a large master plan, but try to define what is your intent, right? We are trying to move people and not like eventually a vehicular-driven infrastructure. So
Yeah.
some of these, just one example of how.
Yeah, it's
want
often
to
like
do
a
it.
chicken and egg situation. Does the network come first, or does the, do you divide the right of way even if you're just building 1 kilometer? So, because it doesn't work without the network. And we know it fails if you have a cycle track just for 1 kilometer.
Yeah.
And then it stops. But at the same time, if you don't show that within the same 24 meters, you can build in a cycle track and run traffic, even if it is just for 1.8 kilometers, then it can be multiplied. So a lot of conversations are about that, where you also get a lot of I guess a lot of people don't like the fact that it's not a network, but it's also a patience game, right? Like you have to build in the network but also prove. So I think we're constantly battling and juggling that.
Yeah, it's my turn to ask the question. So I think like Mansi and Mahesh have elaborated, one of our biggest things that we realized was that once we created these guidelines for master plans, they did not necessarily go through. So we took the route of landscape urbanism, where we said that we'll implement the landscape of our master plan, that will hold the entire thing together. We can see the change happening, the parcel changing from a residential to commercial, the clubhouse not appearing at all, or whatever. The hero of your project was just not going to happen because they ran out of money or whatever. But we were there to sort of respond in an agile manner. And we realized that in India, the guidelines is still, as a scene, is still evolving. Designers are learning how to read them and a lot of that. But I'm sure it's the same with Gehl as well. One thing I really admire that you said was that you started from across the globe, and you're working on several of these geographies. And somehow the best thing about that is that you get to know what's happening across the world in general. There is one challenge that we faced. I think US did massive inroads into bringing and making urbanism sexy for a while, and then suddenly COVID hit, and people just stopped coming to the city, and it's really, really stark in the US right now. Less so in Europe, because working from home is in America you have such big houses and you have such nice places that people don't, widespread places that you don't want to travel 2 hours to come to the city. But in a lot of ways, all that effort of this bringing urbanism back, making density sexy again, the life in a city, the drama, all of that seems to be sort of dwindling away. And we see that in India as well, where a lot of our development is going outside the city for more space, for more openness. As urban designer, is kind of very difficult situation that we find ourselves in. How do you bring back that all these years of effort that we've put in to bring back the city and see if our footprint can be smaller, compact, to now seeing all of that upended by the pandemic? And how do you do all of that again, but in a much quicker time? Do you see this as a trend? Do you see what's happening across the world?
Totally, and I even noticed that we would start to get projects in where there would be a lower density requirement, and they would be more on the edges of cities all of a sudden, right? And a lot of it makes sense, because if you look at the way that cities evolve, some cities are simply running out of brownfield space, or like, classic brownfield, right? And then there might be transit adjacent areas that might have had agricultural usage or something like that, where it's probably a better use of that space to have some sort of mixed use residential, something like that in many ways. And all of a sudden that started to come in. So we had a lot of sort of first dilemmas about it, because we've always been a very sort of urban office and very sort of inner urban office. So how do you deal with a not so dense context? How do you make sure that nature, ecosystems, water, trees, everything else is actually taken care of in a good way? And I think we kind of very quickly pivoted to having we used to call it people first. I never really liked it. It sounds a little bit too much like America first. But from people first to life first was kind of the transition we went through, where we kind of started to, and we're forced into, of course, because you have to, but looking much more at nature, landscape, and making sure that if you do development in those kinds of areas, you do it in a sustainable way, you do it in a way where it makes sense, you minimize the footprint as much as possible. And that's been quite an interesting transition, both, and of course it's not all the work, but there's projects that have those characteristics. And I could also see the merit in some of them, because some of the locations are actually underutilized because you have the investments in transit networks and everything else. Some don't necessarily, but the investment might be coming in. And I think India is probably also a little bit of a different story because of the urbanization rate here is so different than a lot of other places. Yeah. But just to give you an example, I mean, we're currently now going through local plan stage with a sort of medium-low density district in the north of Copenhagen that has a stadium, some big items, but also a lot of residential, which is basically a combination of townhouses, villas, some apartment buildings. And in that project, we really focused on squeezing the parcels as much as possible. So we basically got the average parcel size down to about half of what the usual parcel size would be for that kind of context, meaning that we have much more open space, and the viability of the ecosystems, the viability of nature, it's much better, and actually we're preserving and leaving a lot more open space and a lot more nature than the city had originally intended in their vision plan for the area. So, you know, you can push things in many different ways, and I think there's also then the social component to that is, well, how does life look like in a lower density context, where it's, you know, I can hear the street from here where we're sitting right now. It's completely the opposite. It's like people will be at school, at work. Who's actually going to be spending time there during the day, right? The critical mass of people in the street will be very low. So you kind of have to, instead of thinking like you would think about a big city, you have to think the way that you would think about a very small village. Yeah. And how do you cluster and really make it dense enough locally so that you get that community life and you get those social spaces? What do the courtyards look like? Where can your kids go out to play? And really think about that. And I think the other element that we're pushing a lot in that plan is also saying, well, we need a typology diversity of different, as developers would call it, products, right? Like different housing types, because that also translates into affordability and affordability diversity, right? And we've actually said this is a flexible plan. Every single parcel can be done in a low density, medium density, and high density configuration. They all have, you know, all the hard stuff that we need to deliver. What do we do with water runoff? What do we do with parking, bike parking, everything else? That all works, but they can actually be interchanged for one another. Yeah. But each of them, even the highest density one, still has a couple of villas in it. And even the lowest density one has some apartments. So there's not one density type that only has one dominant kind of housing type, right? And I think that's an interesting way to, you know, it took a lot of work in the process to go through it, because we're not used to thinking like that. Cities are used to thinking one parcel, one housing type, right? Yeah. So that's a lot of challenging the inertia of the system and actually asking people to, hey, could we do this differently? So even in those lower density contexts, I think you can provide a lot of value. I don't think we necessarily, as a profession, need to go into every single one of these projects, because some of them just are maybe without merit, right? I mean, it sounds harsh, but maybe it is. Yeah. But some of them can definitely also maybe provide a new way of living with nature, a new way of doing that while still not expanding our footprint in a way that's unreasonable. So I think it's again pragmatic idealism. You kind of have to play both sides of the coin. Which is the tricky part in our profession, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where, you know, where you started off, and even for all of us as children, I think a little bit of when you're designing those kind of spaces, you're also thinking about where did I like to meet my neighbors and what are the kind of spaces like growing up. And it's so different now. Like we're getting more and more individualistic. Even in a dense city like Mumbai, we don't know our neighbors now, whereas it was very different when we were growing up as children. So I think those kind of plans also will help our kids to make friends in mix, not just make friends with villas if you're living in villas, but also have a friend in a high rise, and then maybe cycle to school, or the old things growing up. I think that's very important. So often I find myself living through a plan as a kid, or as a woman, or as a man. How would they meet? Where do you meet? Where do you gossip? Where do you sit and talk about your children or school? And I think that's really important as urban designers to, like you said, the idea of people first, or living life first, right? And a lot of we also face that in a lot of marketing strategies. We've started marketing isolation, that here is your private space in your private garden, and nobody will ever be able to see that. And that's happening in India as well, and we're liking more and more of that. The more higher
Secure,
the
heightened
higher
sense
you
of
go in your
security.
economic profile, or as you grow in your offices, you want more privacy, you want more seclusion. And I think it will have a bigger impact on our kids, because we're okay, we still have our friends to go back to, but they're growing in that isolation. So do you think that kind of generational impact is happening globally as well? Because in India, our kids have not gone in public transport a lot, as much as we were forced to, because everything was about taking the train. And today, it's not. A lot of our kids are more secure and guarded, and because our economic profiles are changing. So is that happening globally as well, and in Europe especially, because it's all about movement and public transit there versus global cities that are developing?
Well, I really, because again, working with sort of a global team and having all these great places to draw experiences from, I kind of try to avoid using too much Copenhagen in Europe, but I'm just going to do it anyway now, so sorry about that. But I think what's interesting is that, I grew up in a small town, but I actually grew up in these suburban estates, right? They look very much like something you would see from, American movies from the 80s, like E.T. or something like that, like exactly like that, like 150, 200 square meter houses on a 1,000 square meter plot, big backyard, everything else, but still very much kind of a community place. You would bike to school and things like that. The paper boy would come literally out of the movies, right? Just with a different language. But so I think there's been a lot of going through that story, right? I think a lot of Europe was actually heading towards much more car-centric cities, and a lot of Europe's still there actually. And the interesting thing is that this is the thing where people always assume that it's been just an organic thing that happened over time, this whole thing about transit and biking and everything else. I mean, Copenhagen as a city basically was completely dominated by cars in the 60s and 70s. We had the post-war economic boom, everyone got cars. You see old pictures, and all the nice squares and places we have today, they were parking lots, literal parking lots. We had a great tram network. In 1970, they pulled Los Angeles and just got rid of the tram network wholesale. They sold the trams to, I think, Alexandria in Egypt. You can supposedly still find them going around. And put in buses instead, because more flexible, cheaper, run on diesel, great. So they kind of killed the inner city transit network. We still had the S-Train, which is sort of the metro for the region, great separated network, works great, but it doesn't really serve the inner city well. So then, just like the Netherlands, there was a lot of rebellion against this car-centric thing, safety in the streets, kids getting run over, all this stuff. And that led to sort of a movement of bike lanes and biking and things like that, which also coincided with the oil crisis, right? So, so all of a sudden you had car-free Sundays and people got used to this stuff. It was almost like a pilot program before anyone had invented the word. So But this was very much a change that happened due to external factors, due to social factors, and it was gradual and over time. I mean, I remember as a kid in the 80s that there would be new bike lanes popping up everywhere all of a sudden. So it wasn't always there, right? It was a transition that happened, and now it's sort of even being marketed as almost like a tourist destination in many ways. So it's just interesting to see how cities can change over time, and this is, in my lifetime. It's like the last, I remember it, so it must have been when I was, 7, 8, 10 something, so it's in the last 30, 35 years. So
it is possible.
Places can change, and I think then that's just the mobility angle, right? Where that also enables, if you do it right, for instance, your kids can actually bike around, your kids can move a little bit more freely, and we have the same story as what you're saying here. I think there's even there's like some famous mapping exercises being done about this stuff, where you see what's the range of motion of a typical kid in the UK or in Europe or in the US, and it's nothing compared to what it used to be, like 1/10, right? And I'm sure it's the same story here.
Yeah,
exactly.
We're getting closer, keeping them closer to us.
And I think that's actually starting to change a bit. So biking and having a relatively safe bike network helps. My 12-year-old, he can get to school himself. The school's also relatively close by, so that's good. My 8-year-old can actually also do it. If he needs to bike to a friend in the neighborhood, he can do it. So he can sort of have a life of his own. He will, he goes swimming 4 times a week, does competitive swimming. He can actually take public transit there, which is really nice. Also as a family, that you don't have to spend the time to do that. So I would say it's probably shifting due to all the investments that have been made over time in pacifying the streets and the bike lanes and all these things. And that happened in 35 years, basically, or 40 years or something like that. So there is the possibility for things to change in many different ways. But it's all about the physical layout of, how we design our cities.
Yeah, and the grain of it, right? Like we're facing that as well, because a lot of these private developments, they've got really large footprints, and they don't want to be porous. They do not want people to cross through them, and that makes them like these large forts or oases,
bigger
or
developments.
like the utopian life inside the wall, and outside the wall it's chaos. So I think that's also something that we're facing challenges with as urban designers. That can you open up some parts? Can you create destinations that actually allow others to come in, even within private parcels? Can you have, if you cannot have completely public spaces, can it start with some form of a space that at least invites visitors in? So I think that's something that we're struggling here as well.
But there's also a lot of hope, right?
Yeah,
what he just said right now, in the past 35 years, a lot of optimism that can be brought into, like for us, when we see the city and the development around, we are in this whole dilemma where we are constructing like huge coastal roads on one side, with the whole edge of the entire coast transformed into this whole vehicular dominated kind of carriageway and thoroughfare, and at the same time you have these metros which are being constructed everywhere in the city, and the priority has to be set, and the thing is there will be a transformation. There are a lot of voices now about trying to create cycle tracks, or like at least still a long way to go, but there are some hopes that at least get a better footpath done for people to walk and everything, right? So it's like it's a longer range thing. We need to keep that hope alive.
Yeah, I think the narrative is changing now. Now, even in private developments, like Sarfraz has this amazing story that he came with, which is like, can you cycle to school? And that can actually become a selling point for a township, where, within the township, you have a safe passageway to reach the school. And I think that narrative helps bring that it's gone to the marketing level, where even the person selling the house is saying that, hey, your kid can cycle to school if you live here. And I think that narrative is something that can start from an urban design planning.
And that's mobility, right? That's how you move. And I think there's another aspect which is about how you spend time. and how do you actually create communal spaces. And I think a lot of the challenge here is actually sometimes we have to, pack away our ideology a little bit. Where, some of the most successful spaces, and again, now I'm going to reference my own city, which I just promised not to do. But I think one of the interesting stories is that, and this is a recent invention. It's not something that was always there. People actually thought about it and actively designed and, facilitated these choices. Was that, the most inner urban areas actually have great courtyards.
Yeah.
So you're living in an apartment, and this has also changed the city considerably, because that means that, for instance, people who were students in one of the inner urban districts, like for instance where our office is, they, not very long ago, when they graduated, they would buy a house in the burbs and, live kind of, with 2 cars and go to the hypermarket or the strip mall or, the shopping center and sort of live that lifestyle, right? And now, because they also changed a lot of these perimeter block buildings to have much better courtyards, a lot of these were filled with workshops and, small buildings, and they weren't really nice places. They did a lot of work in the 80s and 90s to actually fix some of them and use that as sort of a pilot project. And all of a sudden you get these green, lush garden spaces. And the interesting thing is, they're actually not public. They're shared, but they're not public. And part of the value is that they're not public. So if I live there, I share it with my neighbors. There might be the guy over in number 4 who's a bit crazy and his kids are too loud or something like that. But it's kind of safe. I can send my kids down there to play, and I don't feel unsafe about it. And in many places, there's also quite a wide cross-section of different groups existing together. So we also need to realize that there is a value to having private spaces, but it's private and shared. And maybe even those shared spaces, they will have a little edge garden or something that's completely someone else's. And that's fine. So we need to design with the thresholds, and we need to understand that giving that option is actually allowing people to have that, that value add of the seclusion, of the isolation. You get a bit of that, but you get it in an urban context. And then you go on the street side of the building and you're in a completely public space. And I think that's an interesting twist, where we have a lot of discussions in a lot of different places around this typology, or coming up with something similar, because the way that we can try to influence people's choices about where they buy their homes, where they want to live. It's the story about biking to school, but it's also the story about where do I have my outside spaces, right? And all of a sudden, you can change that story from, oh, it's such a, I have to share it with 80 neighbors, it's such a drag, I want my own, to being like, hey, I can actually entertain my family or extended family coming over, and we can barbecue, or if it's higher market, something that might be a pool or something, like you can have access to more cool stuff by sharing with your neighbors. And I think that's actually an interesting story. It takes a while for people to absorb it, but once it happens, there's a little bit of a shift that happens, and we can actually see versions of that in many different places, which is interesting. And the passive security, it's pretty phenomenal if you do it right.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that are key in this is the proportion of that shared private and public, semi-public space versus the amount of public space that a city has. As soon as it becomes inequitable, where a lot of it is privately owned and private, sort of, even though it's shared with neighbors, but the city actually has barely any space for people in general to meet outside. That is when the proportion, it's all about the mix and the balance. I guess that's amazing. I think we've gone beyond the timeline for our audio event, but one last, I'd like to end with one last bang. I'm going to ask you to move out of Europe, come to Southeast Asia, and tell us about the future of cities in Southeast Asia.
Wow, that's a question. That's a question.
Let's create one.
That is a question. There's so much infrastructure happening now all over the place, and especially India. It's crazy. Coming from even a place that I think is moving quite fast. I went to the top of I live in a new area. I went to the top of a new school that has a rooftop, and literally I could almost only see, besides the towers in the background, like the classical towers of the spires of the parliament and some of the palaces, everything I could see had been built in the last 25 years. Because I live in the harbor of Copenhagen, right? It's a lot of new development. You guys have a lot of that will happen, right? So you have a lot of choices about how do you interact with large-scale infrastructure. How do you make sure that you're not committing some of the mistakes that have been committed in other places? And I think there's so many good examples, but also really bad examples to learn from. How do you deal with issues of mobility? How do you transit? It's interesting to see what's going on in that space in India right now with the metro investments and so on. Maybe there are different ways of actually investing that, but who knows? So I think a lot of it has to do with coming up with an urban model, and that's my hope. An urban model where you embrace the fact that some of these cities are big, vibrant, dynamic places. Not everything needs to be turned into, small, bite-sized, 2 million people cities, something like that. But these are actually big, huge metropolises, and that has a specific quality. You have a very big challenge around the urbanization rate and how that will grow rapidly no matter what, and so many people coming to cities. So what kind of life does that actually allow people to live? And I'm really hopeful for, just things like getting the street trees and the sidewalks and all the basics right.
Yeah.
As you're saying, the balance between public and private spaces and having sort of a fair distribution of things. And also using the fact that you are in these urban, dynamic, diverse spaces to really create places where people get a chance to meet other people from other groups.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of one of the more important things that we can do in our cities, right? The default option is almost to go into isolation with our own social group, but can we actually pull people into these spaces? So that's kind of my hope for the future, but I mean that's not here in general. That's kind of everywhere. So yeah.
That's amazing.
Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our little audio event. Thank you, Esben, for this amazing conversation, this amazing insight into inspiring stories of transformation, not only in Europe, in other places that you have been involved in. And I hope and wish you all the luck and support to go ahead and transform more and more places like Jan did had an impact on you in Melbourne. I hope you will have impact on much younger brains everywhere across the world to actually realize the value of getting people together. So thank you for being part of this conversation at StudioPOD. We are super lucky to have you here. And we hope to have this conversation continue into many more interesting ones as well.
No, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you all for listening in. It was very nice to get a little bit of a discussion and think a little bit broader beyond some of these, the sort of the daily life of the work that we do. So I think that's always an interesting panorama. And thank you very much for hosting me. This was really excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.